Hi there. This video is going to give you an introduction to one of the greatest figures in the Old Testament, Moses. Before we talk about Moses specifically, this is a good time to kind of get straight some of the names that are used for God's chosen people at different points in both Genesis and Exodus, and then the rest of the Old Testament. So Jacob's new name was Israel. So in one sense, Jacob's descendants can be called Israelites. So we'll see the name Israelite used for the chosen people quite a bit. If we're thinking about Israelite as a nationality, Israel doesn't exist as a nation until after the Exodus, until after God's chosen people leave Egypt. So in that sense, we can't really call them Israelites until the ancient nation of Israel gets formed in the book of Joshua. But you're still going to see Israelite used because of the other sense of the word, that the Israelites are the descendants of Jacob, who was known as Israel. Hebrews were people who spoke the Hebrew language and were born into the Hebrew culture. So if we're speaking kind of culturally and then politically, the Hebrews live in Egypt, they leave Egypt, and then when they form a nation, the Hebrews become the Israelites. So that's another way we can look at this group of people. And these Hebrews are also considered Semites. So Semites were kind of larger group of people living in the region of the Middle East, and Hebrews were part of that group, just like Babylonians and other people of other nationalities. And Hebrews are Semites, but not all Semites are Hebrews. So example for you is everyone in our class, you are all Mercy students, but not every Mercy student is part of our class. And then finally, the term Jew comes from being a descendant of the tribe of Judah. So remember, Judah was one of Jacob's 12 sons, founder of one of those 12 tribes, and Judahite was a descendant of Judah, and then eventually that just kind of got shortened to Jew. So there you have it. Israelite, Hebrew, Semite, or Jew, which really sounds like a horrible, horrible game show, but will help you keep straight some of the names for God's chosen people at different points in this unit and then going forward. So a little bit more background here. From about 1300s BC, so about 1300 years before Jesus is on earth, the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten worshipped only the sun god, and he forced other Egyptians to follow his beliefs and only worship the sun god too. And the Hebrews were exposed to that practice while they were living in Egypt. Now, their god, Yahweh, was different than the sun god, but you have this idea about, hey, we could just worship just one God. And so the Israelites worshipped Yahweh exclusively, but they did not deny the existence of other gods. That comes later. So right now, they're saying, wow, there are all these gods out there. There's the sun god, and then there's the rain god, and there's the plant god, and there's the tree god, but we worship this God, Yahweh. That's it. So those other gods, other people can worship those gods. Later, we'll get to a point where the Israelites say, we worship Yahweh because Yahweh is the only God that exists, but we're not quite there yet. And so now let's start talking about Moses. Really, really impossible to give exact dates for Moses' life. So he existed. He was a figure that lived in history, but unfortunately we don't have any records outside of the Bible about Moses. And unfortunately, the Bible's details don't always match other records that exist. So if the Bible says, "Oh, this Pharaoh reigned for this long, and then this Pharaoh reigned," remember, the Bible writers' main goal was not historical accuracy. They were trying to convey a religious message. But scholars think that Moses probably lived in the 13th century BC. And so a little more background on Moses. Moses was a Hebrew child that was raised in an Egyptian household. And chapter 1 of Exodus really transitions us from Joseph's story into Moses' story. So remember, when Joseph's story ends, he's pretty much a hero. So Pharaoh has entrusted him with, with quite a bit of responsibility. He saved the people of Egypt from famine. He saved his family from famine, found a nice Egyptian wife, had a couple of kids. So Jacob and his descendants are living in Egypt. Everybody is nice and happy. But chapter 1 of Exodus, verse 6 tells us Joseph and all his brothers and that whole generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And then verse 8 in chapter 1 makes a transition. Then a new king who knew nothing of Joseph rose to power in Egypt. So that's kind of telling us that a lot of time has passed, and Joseph's story doesn't really mean anything to this new king. And so we end up with so many Israelites in Egypt and a Pharaoh who's kind of afraid of that. And so the Israelites become slaves in ancient Egypt. And that's the Egyptian situation into which Moses is born. And when Moses is born, at the very end of chapter 1 in Exodus, we hear about Pharaoh wanting to kill the boy babies. So Pharaoh's rationale being, if I kill all the Hebrew boy babies, they won't grow up to be strong Hebrew men who can take over my kingdom. He's not really worried about, hey, what'll I do if I have no strong Hebrew men to be my slaves in like 20 years? He's more concerned about the governmental overthrow. So that's what he does. And Moses' mother in chapter 2 gives birth to him and then hides him in some reeds in the river. So if you've ever seen the cartoon story Prince of Egypt, Moses is not like floating down this raging river in a basket. Probably, he was sitting along the shore, not really moving very much at all. And his sister Miriam is sent to watch over him. And it's a great moment. Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, oh, a baby, I've wanted one of these, let me adopt him. And when she adopts him, she needs some other woman to nurse Moses, to provide food for this baby, and sees Miriam and says, can you go get me some woman who's had a child that can help me, nurse this baby? And Miriam, oh yeah, I know exactly the woman. So Miriam gets Moses' own mother to come and, to come and nurse him. And so Moses is able to grow up in safety. And this idea about surviving a brush with death is something that happens pretty commonly in ancient literature. And that's another, the deeper meaning of that is that person is going to grow up to do something great. And it's not an accident that in the New Testament, Matthew is going to have Jesus go through a similar experience. And we'll see some other characters in the Old Testament survive their own kind of childhood brushes with death. And so just like numbers in the Bible mean something and name changes mean something, surviving some sort of threat to your life as a young child means something too. And so Moses comes to be a shepherd in Midian and has this experience of seeing God in a burning bush. So the bush is burning and starts talking to Moses. And this is where we get God revealing God's name. God says, I am Yahweh. And this experience, this appearance by God is called a theophany. And we will look at that theophany a little more in class. So that's a little bit of background on Moses, who's one of the greatest figures in the Old Testament. So just like his childhood brush with death means something, for the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament, should always be a signal to you whenever someone is compared to Moses. That's a pretty big compliment, and we'll start looking at why in class. See you then.